So let me begin on my left here with Charles Halperin. He's the director of the Berkeley Initiative for Mindfulness in Law at the University of California. And as you'll hear in the course of this next session, he's really been a leader in bringing mindfulness into the study and the practice of law. So if you can imagine what that must be like and the importance of the legal framework, I think we'll have a great deal to learn from Charles. Next to Charles is Kirsten Delay, and she has been really active in the hospice movement since the early 90s, and in a similar way has been bringing contemplative practice into a different field, which is the healthcare field, working with residents, healthcare workers to really bring these contemplative practices into their own life. And we'll hear a little bit from her how that impacts on their professional skills and on the well-being of the patients. Next to Kirsten is Dan Schuessler, and he's an entrepreneur and founding partner of Bayswater Asset Management. And he has been increasingly interested in bringing meditation and mindfulness and ethical decision-making into business, both for himself and beginning to train others to do that as well. And finally, we have Arturo, who you know from just a few moments ago, working with Facebook. He'll be also engaging with us in this conversation. So welcome, everybody. One of the things that we had a little co-conspiracy dialogue in the green room about was how we were going to start this session. And I'd like to invite Charles to bring us all into our bodies and into our seats here in the room with a moment of mindfulness.
So this is when I'm teaching my class in meditation and law at the University of California at Berkeley Law School. We start each class first with Qigong outside under the redwood trees, and then we walk mindfully from there into the classroom and we do our sitting meditation practice. And it sets a framework for our discussions that creates a much deeper and richer and more disclosive kind of discussion. And it also helps people drop the energy of the corridors of the law school, the trauma and the activity that they leave behind them when they come into our class, which is seen as a kind of an oasis. So I'd just like to start with a short meditation here. It's I think, helpful, even in a setting which already is on such a mindful course. So I'll sound the bell once to begin. For those of you who are not meditators, I'll give some brief instructions, and then we'll sit for a few minutes, and then I'll sound the bell again to signal the end of the period. Find yourself a comfortable posture, your feet solidly planted on the floor, your spine upright, your upper body relaxed. Let your eyes fall shut if that's comfortable for you, or keep them open with a kind of unfocused gaze. Connect with the breath, following each in-breath and each out-breath. And when your attention wanders, gently draw it back into the body, to the breath, and to the present moment. Let your breath be the anchor that holds your awareness in the present moment. And I invite you to hold that focused attention that we just shared for a moment in silence throughout this session, throughout this day. And as your attention is drawn away, gently and without self-criticism, bring it back into this moment, and then the next moment.
Thank you so much, Charles. That's actually a perfect segue to my first question to you, which is really to ask how a personal practice, whether it's meditation or mindfulness, has actually inspired or infused the work that you're doing and the calling that you feel to be doing the work that you're doing in the world.
I have to go a little further back into history. I grew up in a low empathy zone. I grew up in a nourishing family in Buffalo, New York, but it was a place where my family, for whatever reason, had a very limited sense of their own safety and security and what they viewed as their circle of compassion. They were the first American-born children of immigrant parents and had that insecurity. They lived at a time when anti-Semitism was explicit and overt in the United States. And at the time of my birth was the time when the Holocaust was just beginning to unwind. So the fact that they didn't have a kind of universal sense of interbeing and connection with the whole population of the globe is not surprising. And I was raised with a certain sense of cautiousness and a sense of empathy for this very small and discreet circle. And as I entered the educational mill, I was taken up pretty much by the ethic of competition and individualism that characterized our schools then and characterize our schools now. Empathy and compassion were not on the curriculum in K through 12 or in college. And in law school, we find a particularly assertive kind of individualism, which shapes the adversarial process that characterizes our legal system at this time, and where a quality of toughness and hyper-rationality is what is valued. And then I went into a law practice, and at this point, and of course the idea of meditation at that point was very far off my radar screen, and really hadn't entered the kind of national consciousness. This is a period when the Beats are just starting to, the Beat poets, Gary Snyder and Allen Ginsberg, are just starting to develop their own meditation practice and infuse this into the culture, one of the great gifts that the Beats made. And I became a public interest lawyer, and I did a lot of good work that was, I think, important to do in environmental and in other matters. But it really wasn't moved from an open heart or from a place of compassion. It was much more kind of fear of what was happening, anger at the irresponsibility of corporate leaders who seemed to have so little concern about the health of their workers or the health of the globe. That was what was motivating me. Good work. I'm proud of it as I look back on it. But it seemed to me coming from an incomplete place within me. So now I'm getting around to answering your question. When I had an unusual opportunity, which was to start a law school and to rethink the systems of legal education and try to redesign a law school that would educate public interest lawyers and try to educate them as whole people who were emotional beings as well as all of us are, hyper-rational. So it was a great opportunity, and it was also a great challenge. I didn't understand when I took the job what a challenge it was. The City University of New York is not an easy place to innovate. The political climate in Queens, New York at that time was deeply corrupt, and that's where our law school was. So I had some challenges, and a friend of mine, as I was clearly being pulled apart by all of the different demands on me from diverse constituents. And a friend of mine said, "Why don't you try meditation?" I said, "What's that going to do for me?" First I said, "What's that?" And then when he explained it, I said, "What's that going to do for me?" And he said, "Just try it. Get up 15 minutes early in the morning, just sit," and he gives the instructions, these simple instructions I gave you. Watch your breath, draw your attention back into the body in the present moment. And he says, see if you don't reach a place of stillness, that then later in the course of the day, when the chancellor is calling you up to encourage you to admit into the first year class some unqualified son of an influential politician in New York, instead of just flying off the handle or falling into deep depression, just take a few breaths and see if you don't tap into that place of silence. And if you do, that's great, and you can go forward with it. So I tried it, and sure enough, it was extremely helpful to me. And over the years, my meditation practice deepened, and I saw that managing stress was an important and valuable quality of it, but that wasn't the whole story. And that was when empathy and compassion opened to me. I then had a wonderful and unique opportunity to be the first president of a substantial foundation in New York City. And we became, I think, we had two firsts in our foundation. We weren't the biggest, and we weren't the best connected foundation, but we had two things that were unique. One was we had a meditation room. So employees or grantees or potential grantees could come and sit together in silence. At 3 o'clock every day, whoever was available would come and sit, but anyone could go in there at any time. That was one thing. And the other thing was we made contemplative practice an explicit grant-making area of ours. So that really brought me, and since there were no other foundations making grants in this area, I met a lot of the influential teachers of those days and of the important institutions that had been pioneering. This is in the 1990s. We started something called the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, which kind of echoes the name of this conference. And what we decided was going to be our role was to bring contemplative practices out into society where we felt that there was such a need and such a gap. It was a somewhat countercultural effort, but that's what we did. And we didn't have a lot of money, but we had enough money to get things started in a lot of programs. So then, when I left that job, I moved out to Berkeley and was thinking about what's next. It was a kind of a retirement, but not exactly. And I started, first informally, just teaching in a small, informal group at the Berkeley Law School, started teaching meditation practice. And a group of students started to coalesce around that. And then I went to the dean and said, well, what if I offered a course? I'd like to offer a 2-credit seminar, which I named Effective and Sustainable Law Practice, the Meditative Perspective. And he said, he didn't know exactly what I was talking about, but he said, if 10 students sign up for it, you can give the course. That was their limit. You had to have 10 students. So the first year, I think, to his surprise and mine, we had 40 students sign up.
Wow.
And every year since then, that was 7 years ago, there have been about 40 students sign up for it. We take about 20. And they find it a very important and useful conversation. And now we've set up the Berkeley Initiative for Mindfulness in Law, which has a whole panoply of programs, a speaker series, a website, a lot of stuff, an informal meditation group. And one thing that I particularly value is the introductory course we give to first-year law students. So 4 weeks long, they get no credit for it. They have a daily meditation obligation. They have also some modest writing obligations. It's really a beautiful program. But when I think of bringing mindfulness and compassion and empathy out into the world, I think, first of all, of personal transformation. That's the first line. It's my own, it's the solidity of my own practice, which is a continual work in progress. And then it's bringing it out to people who really could change their consciousness and their awareness at a vital point. Law school is a powerful socializing institution. I get them during the first, this year it worked out, so I had them the first week of law school. It's only 4 weeks, it's just a taste. I want to give you a sense of what the impact is by reading you a reflection by one of my students in the course. She says, I've noticed similar themes emerge in this course and in other parts of my life. Conversations with student groups and in the public interest community in the law school. People continue to emphasize the importance of empathy, human connection, and interestingly, forgiveness in the legal profession. Intuitively, this obviously makes sense, but I've taken great comfort in knowing that I'm part of a community that values these concepts. And she goes on, I spent last Saturday at a restorative justice symposium at San Quentin, the great federal prison that's just across San Francisco Bay from where we are now. The theme of the day was forgiving to heal. In circles, the inmates and the outsiders talked about the process of forgiving, and I found it very reminiscent of the process of meditating. There are strong parallels between the process of acknowledging a thought, being non-judgmental and letting it go, and the process of acknowledging a wrong, seeking understanding and forgiving. Seeking understanding and forgiving. A victim, the keynote speaker, spoke about her experience of forgiving the men who killed her daughter, and even said that forgiveness was nothing more than letting go. This daily practice has resonated in so many aspects of my life during these past few weeks. I've been more understanding with my boyfriend, sought to empathize during arguments, and have prioritized forgiveness. I have recognized stress at school and in my life, but tried to dismiss it without effort. I have sought to be kind and understanding with my classmates, and recognize that this is a time of transition and difficult for everyone. Mostly, I've been walking around in a state of disbelief that this is actually me. I'm overjoyed with how I've been feeling. I feel very committed to continuing this practice.
Wow, thanks so much, Charles. I think that's a perfect transition to share with Kirsten, who's also working in a very challenging profession and catching people at a time in their lives, end of life or facing a serious illness, where having somebody who's got a compassionate heart could really make a difference. Kirsten, maybe you could share some of your experiences with us.
Thank you. And also thank you, Charles, for just allowing us to rest our minds without a PowerPoint and just to be. Because what I learned over the years, we cannot do compassion, you know? We are human beings. It's about being compassionate, being kind. So compassion is actually a verb and a way of being. So thank you as a reminder. And I sometimes struggle when I asked, contemplative practice, because I hear it as a very abstract thing. Yeah, something outside of myself I'm doing to me, to get better, to get ahead, even become more compassionate, as if there's something missing. Yeah. So what I've learned over the time that any practice, meditation, mindfulness practice, or specifically compassion reflections, have helped me just to connect with myself, with my own good heart, and also become friends with this sometimes quite scary landscape of my mind. And you asked earlier what got us into it, and I realized my interest was mostly the education of the human heart. What makes people tick? Why do we do what we do? And so I always was fascinated when people go work at, like you, Julia, in Africa, the trenches of suffering. how do they cope with that? How do they make meaning? We have heard Viktor Frankl, who survived the Holocaust, and said you can endure as much suffering as long as it has meaning. So I was always fascinated by this, and so I began working in hospice many years ago, and first in Germany, where I grew up. At that time, it was very clinical, and I just thought there must be a different way, because we're all human beings. So at the end of life, I don't want to die as a case. I don't want to be a technician sitting at the bedside either. So I came to San Francisco, as maybe some of us, and I worked at the San Hospice, and at that time, they had volunteers go to Laguna Honda, and I know some of you have worked there. Laguna Honda was at the time the largest residential nursing home, and they had the only open hospice ward still in existence in this country, with 28 beds. Imagine 28 beds in one room. Everybody's dying, everybody's terminally ill, men and women together, only divided by curtains. So you really literally had no privacy. And I remember my interview to become a volunteer, and so the person, she asked me, so she described the scene, what I would encounter. You know, there are people from the mission, from Japantown, from Chinatown, people who've lived all their lives on the streets, and here I was, well-educated, European, white, middle class. You know, the clash couldn't be bigger. And she asked me, do you think you can do this? And I said, I don't know. Then she continued describing the smells, what I would smell, you know, when people come close to death. Because some people come there who had no treatment, they had open tumors. And how would you feel about that? Can you manage? And I said, I don't know. And I will give it a try. And she said, okay. So, and I remember going up when you get off here, probably many of us are from San Francisco, when you leave Forest Hill Station, you go up this long staircase to Laguna Honda, and I remember since this day going up these staircase to these hospitals, and my knees were shivering. I was completely a mess because I did not know what I would encounter. And to my utter surprise and astonishment, and I encountered the greatest gift in my life, opening this door. Because there was a whole community there. And I was really touched what you said earlier about the need for community. And where the suffering is the greatest, there is the love is the greatest, compassion is the greatest. So I walked into this ward, there was the greatest compassion. And so the CNAs taught me about compassion, how to be present. The patients taught me how to show up and not to turn around and not to succumb to fear. They taught me about courage and fearlessness. And it doesn't mean I'm not afraid. I'm still afraid. I'm still sitting here, oh God, do I say the right word? I know, it's performance anxiety, but still like connecting as a human being, yeah, and showing up regardless, that courage. And that also then drove me to finding a way of understanding suffering more deeply, to my own contemplative practice. And so I began to study with Sogyal Rinpoche, who've written the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. And I thought, oh, there is somebody who has more wisdom than I have. And also to see there's a whole training path. You know, I'm not the first person in this universe who's trying to figure out how to be present with suffering. Many people walked this path before me, and also to see there is that compassion can be unbiased, not limited to the person I like, and not to include the person I do not like. You know, I like in Facebook, I like. So I like the 7 billion people in this world. I aspire to at least aspiration, you know. So then I got involved in an outreach program that is really dedicated to making a change in healthcare, a change in care in generally, how we care for the living and the dying, the spiritual care program. And we're in 11 countries. We trained about 30,000 people. That doesn't sound much, but we are mostly a volunteer organization. And the beauty is also I have the fortune to go to different countries and teach contemplative practice, such as mindfulness, meditation, compassion practices, how you open your heart and be present. And the beauty is, it doesn't matter if you. I just did a session, my very first session in South America, and I didn't know how that would go with, Latinos. I had no idea. I don't speak Spanish. And I also work a lot with people who've never, ever sat still in their entire lives. Yeah. And to see it works. You go slow, short sessions many times over, and making friends with yourselves. And then to see that is such a universal language and the beauty of it, So I was really touched what you said, the universality of our needs. And that's the connecting factor, And there are spiritual needs underneath it that we need to address as people go through crisis. It does not always have to be the traumatic end of life, but the everyday, going through a divorce, going through a loss, not knowing what to say next because you feel inadequate. How do we handle that? So I'm really fortunate to work in this field. When people ask me, so why did you come here? I said, well, why wouldn't I come here today? And it's to sit here in a room on a Friday morning, late morning, and talk about compassion. And what I also learned, it's not so useful to talk so much about compassion, actually. It's an action. I said it's a way of being, but compassion is also, we have to put it in action. And this is why I'm really glad of being part of this movement of changing the way we care, and especially in this country. And there is so much need, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Krista. Really touched by your reflections and thinking what a difference it would make to have someone like you at the bedside of somebody who's dying and to go through those issues with you. You're just embodying that presence even on the stage. So thank you for sharing that. Over to you, Dan, in a very different field of work and business, but you've also been working very much with personal practice and trying to bring it into ethical decision making. We'd love to hear a little bit more of your own experience.
Charles started by saying he grew up in a low empathy zone, and I think I worked in a low empathy zone for about 25 years or so. But it wasn't actually work so much that brought me to compassion. It was more of my personal life. My sister got sick and was battling cancer for about 5 years. And when she died of cancer, it really kind of brought a personal crisis for me. Because my family just didn't have a way to cope with this that I felt was appropriate or effective. And I started looking around for, answers to questions that I think we all ask naturally when we're young and curious and, think that it's great to ask these questions and be curious about them and that we also believe we can find answers to them. And questions, like, why am I here? What's the meaning of life? And those questions tend to fade to the background when the really big issues of life, like, how much is next month's rent payment, start to creep into life. And, we tend to stop asking those questions, not because we're not interested, but it's just, they fade to the background. And oftentimes, I'm probably very typical. I bet there are others here who've had the same experience, but those questions come back as soon as you have a crisis like that in your life. And, the questions maybe change slightly. Why is there so much suffering? Why did my sister have to suffer that much? And like Kirsten, I found the answers from the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. And what's really interesting is the first edition of that book had a phone number in the back of it you could call to get in touch with with the Rigpa organization. And one of the first times I called and one of the first people I spoke with is sitting right here. Yeah, I know. I never told you that story, I don't think. Yeah, believe it or not. So that was actually kind of nice. So one of the reasons I'm here is because, not only was the book a fantastic book and had these great teachings, but then I met the people and they seemed to really be doing their best to embody those teachings. And so for me, compassion kind of snuck in through the back door. It was a bit of I was not looking for compassion. I didn't think it would be helpful, at all. And, it just kind of, through looking for answers to these other questions, it finally kind of hit me, oh, maybe there's something going on there that I need to pay attention to. And that has turned out to be true. And it has turned out to be not unhelpful in the workplace. So that's why I'm here.
Okay, thank you so much, Dan. Arturo, over to you. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your own path to this place and the way that you're bringing kind of spiritual view or spiritual practice into your own work with Facebook.
For me, this whole path showed up as a person who entered my life. And I have to say, up to that point, it was very incoherent. There were all these different facets of my life that I kept very separate from each other. There was the person that I showed up in the workplace. There was kind of my photography and my work there. There was kind of how I showed up being at home, and all these things were very separate from each other. The person has helped me explore and understand, like, what if it's all one thing? What if they're all connected? And I came from a place where the mathematician by degree and a security guy by profession, a lot of the work that I had to do was involved in asking people why they were doing things, questioning motives, all these other things, which is actually fairly confrontational, even though it's not intended to be that way. And so we literally had to drag me to my first Wisdom 2.0 conference. That's the same person. It's like, you should be there. I'm like, no, that's crazy stuff. And then I realized, and I'm deeply humbled by people who have embodied these practices for their lifetime, because I feel like a total, the technical term is noob.
Did everyone get that? Noob.
Where I kind of began understanding and appreciating that there's these incredible set of people at Berkeley and other places who are studying kind of the science of how we relate to each other. And then that there's all of these amazing different practitioners and traditions. And by tradition, I mean really broad things, not just Tibetan, but like medicine wheels from Native American tradition. I need to go back to Mexico and study what the healing traditions there hold and all these other things. And then this kind of modern day technology and what it means to me as a manager, as a father, as a friend, as a photographer, and these other things. And so for me, the journey is still very much a work in progress, one of coherence and integration. And the question that I play with or try to work through is, like, if I have this set of values, what do they mean to me as a father, right? And what do they mean to me and the people that I support in the workplace? What do they mean to me as a friend or a partner with the people in my life? And so all the bullying work at Facebook stemmed from, like, my son was going to just turn 13, and I wanted him to have the tools that would be good for him and the people around him. A lot of the stuff that we're kind of applying and practicing from the science and the tradition shows up in the way I write email or when something happens at work that gets me really activated and my heart is pounding. And so I think that the journey that is interesting when I look at something like compassion, I try to center it around like 3 questions. One of them is, what does it mean for myself? Another one is, what does it mean for the people I'm in relationship with, including my workplace? Like, how do I show up? If I'm a manager, how do I set up the tone for the team or the groups that I support, if I can help shape that? And then the third one is, what does it mean in the contribution that I'm here to bring to the world, in the product my company builds, in the thing that my classes teach, the thing that I want to bring out into the world. And it is those three things that I'm still kind of fumbling my way through and trying to figure it out.
Well, we've heard from 4 very different but very outstanding individuals who are bringing a personal view and a personal practice into their work lives. We have an opportunity now to maybe hear a little bit from our audience if you have questions or comments. We have a microphone I see here and one over here. Please don't be shy. There's no question. Arturo said he'll answer any question that anybody asks. So this is an opportunity to find out a little bit more from our speakers about their own experiences.
So my name is Sebastian Boo. I'm from London. I work with the Student Wellbeing Service at the London School of Economics. And I'm keen to hear from the panel how they would start a conversation with the Director of Human Resources in a large organisation, in my case a university, about compassion and how it might be a nice idea to give employees, staff and faculty access to some kind of introductory sessions on compassion. And so, I mean, I've been here this week and I've got all these ideas in my head, but I'd love to hear how you would initiate a 10, 15-minute conversation with somebody who is compassion naive in the sense of it being something that can be cultivated. And I mean, intuitively, most people will say, "Oh, that's a good idea," but how do you sell it? How would you go about doing that?
Thank you for your question. I've been kind of swimming in those waters for some years at Berkeley Law School, and what I found, of course, you have to start with people from where they are. And in much of higher education in this country, the common denominator for students, faculty, and administrators is anxiety and stress. They're working harder than they ever have before. Budgets are shrinking. They're swimming through this rushing torrent of information that now each of us carries a little machine in our pocket to make sure that we don't miss anything. And so I start with stress. When I think of the students who first showed up for our course, it was stress that brought them there for the most part. They were, a lot of them who had, this is a very elite law school, and so these are people who've really risen to the top of the academic pyramid. They are incredibly stressed, and many of them have a quite startling self-doubt. Really, a feeling that they are that everyone in their classrooms understands things better than they do. So I think that's one of the things that brings them to want to come to a place where they can stop, they can be still, they can look inward, and they're in a place where they find that they have to cultivate inner resources. And as lawyers, they're people who've always been looking outward. So all of this makes them open to this process. The human resources section of the university is surely dealing with large amounts of distress around these kinds of issues. So I think that this is an area where the idea of skillful means has to be brought forward. And the resistance to preach and pretend that we have a panacea has to be avoided. And that's, whatever else contemplative practice is, it certainly isn't a panacea. So with that kind of sensitivity, I think we're at a very good moment, because so many institutions, like higher education, are really feeling lost. And they're really looking for something. And 15 years ago, they wouldn't have thought, well, mindfulness is what we should be looking for. But now things are different. I've been doing this in higher education for 15 years. And I've seen the growth of sophistication about and respect for mindfulness during this period. So I think it's a good moment. I had the stunning experience 2 weeks ago in England of participating in a parliamentary hearing on mindfulness and criminal justice. Wow. It turns out that over 100 members of parliament have gone through an 8-week Kabat-Zinn-based training program. 100 members of parliament. And there were about a dozen of them there in this hearing that they wanted me to participate because we have a mindfulness in criminal justice project that we're doing. And that was the subject of their hearing. So they wanted to know what's going on in the United States. And they had brought people in from all over England who were working in the prisons, in the juvenile detention facilities, in parole offices, and they were bringing in mindfulness practices. So I wouldn't have known this before I discovered this incredibly engaged parliamentary group that I think England is probably pretty fertile ground. I would check out, for example, the Mindfulness Center at Oxford University.
So you said London School of Economics, was that right? And so, you know, in business and economics, compassion isn't usually a hot topic, but ethics is, and there's a direct relationship. It's not obvious, but there's a direct relationship between ethics and compassion. And it really stems from the definition of compassion, which is wishing to alleviate suffering and its causes. And if you start with that and you then look at, well, okay, what might the first level of compassionate behavior be? The very basic, it's maybe perhaps just compassion for yourself, attempting to alleviate suffering for yourself and the causes of suffering for yourself. And the ethical behavior that goes along with that, that links to that, you could say it's the sort of very basic first level of the golden rule of, do unto others as we would have them do unto you. It's do not harm. Now, it might be a little surprising that that's the ethical behavior that corresponds to trying to alleviate, self-suffering. But do no harm is the basic fundamental ethical behavior that correlates one-to-one with alleviating suffering for yourself. And now, if you can really sort of get to the point where you're enthusiastically engaged in that just for yourself, you might have this sense that maybe you want to expand that a little bit. And if you do, the next step is, of course, trying to alleviate suffering and the causes of suffering for others. And the stages of doing that, the way we train ourselves to do that, are these practices called seeing others as being just like yourself, because we are the same, actually, in really very important ways, most especially the fact that we all don't want pain and suffering. We all want happiness. Everyone, absolutely everyone, is the same in that regard, and that is the first step towards actually developing compassion for other peoples. And of course, then the ethical behavior that corresponds to that is to try to alleviate suffering for others, to begin down that road. And it expands from there as well. I mean, it doesn't stop there, but that's the first step. So there's a direct link between ethics and compassion, and ethics is a hot topic, and so you might be able to, if you can convince people of the link, then you might be able to make it a topic worthy of conversation.
Thanks for those fantastic answers. I just want to say, the bringing in the ethical issues, bringing in the stress and the burnout issues, they're really practical ways to bring in what we're talking about here in terms of compassion. I just want to make sure I'm not missing someone on this side who is waiting for a question. We have one here, and then our young lady over here.
I'm from Puerto Rico, and I think the issue of compassion should be diverse and present as many diverse voices, so I appreciate that you're in this panel as a Latino man. But also, I want to talk about social media and compassion because I ran for political office last week. I was one of the 14 candidates running for Santa Monica City Council on a compassionate platform. I was the only candidate running, and this was my T-shirt, Vote for Love. I only use social media as my campaign strategy. So I use Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and email. I didn't want to use any paper because I think the environmental consequences of that are huge, and we have to be compassionate towards the environment. That is who is sustaining us in this planet right now. So I want to talk and ask you and ask the other panelists, because you touch really important subjects that go into governance and politics, such as ethics, which is huge in politics, and alleviating suffering, which is huge in politics, and the golden rule, do not do harm into others. And these are issues that are important for my personal platform and should be brought to every politician and every person in governance. How social media can help us to spread the message of compassion in politics, so it becomes a reality, because social media allows us to get a message spread really fast. And how social media can strategize a campaign on compassion, so our leaders, not only in the United States but around the world, consider and bring compassion and empathy into their governance and into the cities to build model cities of compassion. Thank you.
I vote for love. So I think a couple of things. One of them is that I believe it's incredibly important to use social media intentionally. So when you hear somebody about the stresses that come from it, that you have to choose the people that you relate to. I think it's important to be thoughtful about the things that you share, because you're asking the set of people around you to pay attention to that. At the same time, I think it's important for communication mediums like social media to provide voices for all sorts of different kinds of values. And so one of the things which is important is being able to offer something for as a platform for somebody who pursues a very different set of values than the ones that you were talking about, and being very respectful of that. And it's difficult. It's difficult when you're in kind of a social thread and somebody espouses a value really different from yours. Those conversations can go sideways pretty easily. And so my hope is for people to have a better listening of each other and a more respectful discourse. As far as distribution for these things, so that it reaches as many people as possible, it's really an exercise of being able to put them out there and then letting other people carry them. And part of what distracts about the social media aspect of this is people spend too much attention, I think, on the media angle of this, whereas really what this ends up being amplifiers for communities, and people are trying to put ideas out into the world, but the thing that you want to cultivate is the community. Because it's the community that's going to carry the ideas forward to other people. I mean, anything that happens in social media, there's a human person sharing, saying, commenting, saying, I believe in this. And so I would recommend the cultivation of community and intentional use of these communication tools for cultivating community. And it is through that I think the more profound change will come.
I'm really glad that the subject of compassion in politics has come up, because I think it's urgent. Arturo, you talked about all the different roles you have. Well, one of our roles is as a political actor. And I just want to say a word I really admire your effort, and a word for bringing our compassion into our lives as political actors, as voters and supporters of one policy or another. I'll give you an example that is very close to my heart because it relates to my Mindfulness in Law project, and that is to go back to San Quentin San Quentin Prison across the bay. 4,000 prisoners, and it's part of a prison system in the United States which is the antithesis of compassion. We, as probably you know, imprison more people than any other country in the world. They're predominantly black and brown, and the amount of suffering in San Quentin is immeasurable, and the amount of suffering among the families of the people who are kept there for decades or for life is also incalculable. And for those of us who want to express ourselves fully as compassionate people, we have an opportunity to do something about this. We Californians can be proud that we just passed a statewide proposition which establishes some ground rules which will reduce our prison population. So I just want to say that word for carrying our open hearts into the voting booth with us and demand of our politicians that they sign up for a compassionate program, and not just as a kind of a good word, but something that has some bite, where it comes down to, for example, stop and frisk policy. One of the mayors who wasn't here yesterday was Michael Bloomberg, who set up a regime in New York City, which in many respects is a model, but was so oppressive to people of color who couldn't walk the streets of New York without risk of harassment or arrest. That's not something that we do in a compassionate society. So that's a plea for engagement with these kinds of important public issues.
Thanks so much, Charles. I wanted to add maybe a little reflection from Bhutan that they had their first democratic elections in the country very recently, and there was a lot of polarization in the way the candidates were portrayed in the media, and it brought to the Bhutanese attention the importance of educating the public and the media. And there's actually a Bhutan Center for Media and Democracy that is really trying to learn from what happens when you import a democratic system to a monarchy. Does it actually lead to more conversation, or does it lead to replication of a system that maybe isn't working so well in other countries? So I thank you for that question. I think it's really relevant. We had another question here.
This is relative to Kirsten's work. I work at UCSF's Integrative Medicine Center, and we also have a component that is for education for the UCSF medical students, and we have a relatively new elective called Integrative Medicine in End-of-Life Care, and it has been filling every single time since it's been offered. So I just wanted to, and it's in collaboration with the San Francisco Zen Center, BJ Miller, which is great. So I just wanted to let people know there's the medical students themselves, the future doctors, are being trained on a compassionate and integrative approach to medical care. And I just loved, it was so poignant. You said, I didn't want to be a technician at the bedside. And so for our medical doctors to have that same mindset is going to be a big shift going forward. So thank you for your work.
I think that's the most exciting to start when people start their career early, be in law school, in healthcare, medicine, but also in the schools. Our kids. These are going to be our future caregivers. Good luck. I don't want to be cynical, but we have to really educate the next generation. That's our responsibility, and that's also our responsibility for change. And it gives me great joy to see this movement is coming more and more. And I would love to see even more, because it's more than a PowerPoint presentation. Because compassion needs cultivation. It does take time. You cannot learn it in an hour workshop and a panel talk. You get inspired, yeah? But it does take time. As Rick Hansen said, he used the word installation. Yeah? We get activated, we feel great, we feel inspired, and then Saturday morning hits, and then what? Or we get provoked, and then what? So it really does take time, this cultivation. It does take time, and it will take maybe one generation or more, or the next generation of physicians, of nurses, where it's a whole culture change. The beautiful thing with contemplative practice, you can use it right then and there in the moment. It's very practical. I don't have to go anywhere else. I don't have to leave the situation. If I trained my mind in it, I can actually work right then and there with the situation. That's the power of it. Because a lot of people think, contemplative practice, it's airy-fairy, and what's the use of it, And I do not have time anyway. You forget it, yeah? But it's efficient. We have seen in neuroscience, we take 5 minutes, it makes a world of a difference. And we can do it in the moment. How many times in the day do we sit quietly, even here on this panel, on the bus, on the BART, on the plane? We sit a lot of times. Another thing with change, what you were saying with social media, I think it's a tremendous, tremendous opportunity to use social media for these really, really good causes. And really because we are all customers in one way, but no, customer is actually not the right word. We all kind of, we can be all advocates, and it's all up to us. This social change to social media is very powerful, and I was very glad that Arturo, you said it doesn't replace the human interaction. It still does need community. So everything through social media is the first step. You need actually a dialogue like here in this room. I still need to see you, hear you, and talk to you. I need to go to a boardroom to talk to hospital administrators, the most scary thing, yeah. But we need to talk to people, and we need to learn to listen and not come in with our own good ideas, because we are convinced, yeah. Yeah, so thank you for your work, yeah.
Thank you, and thank you to our audience for those great questions. I think we're going to need to wrap up the session now, but as we saw, we managed to squeeze 2 minutes of meditation practice into the middle of a busy conference schedule. And I want to thank the audience for the quality of your listening and the quality of your questions. It was really a heartfelt space. And thank you to our panelists for sharing their experiences right from the heart. Thank you, everybody.